And what most kids are missing, and what traditional therapies and interventions can't quite get into deep enough and hit reset, repair, and stimulate and get the nervous system back on track, that's what's missing. And that's what we're going to talk about right here with this one. Welcome to the Experience Miracles podcast, where we help parents find hope, answers, and drug-free help to overcome your child's chronic health challenges. I'm your host, Dr. Tony Ebel, and I'll be sharing my experiences as both a dad and a doctor on every episode. I can take the latest science and neurology of healing and break it down in the most simple and relatable way possible. We'll take on the toughest topics and answer your biggest questions through interviews with other amazing parents and leading experts, leaving you with practical action steps that you can take to help your child heal and thrive. It's time to expect and experience miracles. Let's get started. Let's talk about speech delays. This is a challenge that 1 in 12 kids, and some research would say even more, are facing every single day. And in that research, we're actually talking about 3 to 17-year-olds. And so especially if they're older and later in that age arc and conversation right there, this is a big deal, because if your child struggles with the execution, the formation, the expression of speech, and it's hard for them to clearly communicate with others, that really leads to a lot of other challenges, like sensory challenges, social, emotional, behavioral challenges, because obviously, as we get older and really throughout all of life, communication is essential to socialization. It's essential to academic, to learning, to communicating with peers and classmates and friends and teachers and coaches and everything else. So this one conversation, speech delays, is really about a conversation about a lot of challenges that way too many kids have. And we want to get right into it. Say, here's the deal. Speech delays are often blamed on motor output problems. Traditional interventions like speech therapy, who we love and work in coordination with on the regular, are absolutely barking up the right tree, but are they getting to the roots when we say, oh, this speech issue, it's just a muscular issue, it's just a vocal cords issue? And when we look at the traditional approach that speech therapy and traditional interventions are going after, then parents really know. You've been to dozens, hundreds maybe even of speech therapy appointments. You've spent hours there. You've worked on all the vocalizations and the exercises at home, and maybe even spent thousands of dollars, either covered by insurance or not. And really, many parents can relate to this. How many times have you been frustrated, maybe even got upset with your child because as you hear them attempt to make these speech sound formations, you know, hey, it sounds like the pieces and parts are all there. You just need to do it this way. You need to use your muscles. You need to use your tongue. You need to use your vocal cords in this more clear way. But what if it's not an output problem? What if it's not only a muscle problem? What if it's an input and integration problem? In this one right here, you're going to learn all about the neurology and the neuromechanistic, neuromotor approach behind speech and communication. And we'll get pretty nerdy and we'll get pretty neuroscience-y. But we're also going to keep it really simple, because for this conversation, that's the most important way we can teach it to you. Speech is a 3-step process. And what you hear and what sounds like from the outside looking in to be the problem, the expression and the formation or the output of speech, is actually step 3 on the neurological mechanism, the 3-step process that is speech formation. And so often the challenges with expression and muscular coordination on the outside with speech are actually kind of just a symptom or a physical representation of the actual root cause, which is on the input and coordination or integration and processing side of things. And I cannot wait to teach you all about that. But first, let's give you a real life story that will be so relatable to so many families and talk about our little man, Cohen, whose transformation perfectly illustrates this conversation right here. Before finding neurologically focused chiropractic care, Cohen had severe speech delay with difficulty even initiating sounds and very little sound production at all. His parents were struggling to find support beyond traditional speech therapy because everything they read stated that Cohen's struggles were neurological in origin. So what they kept thinking is there must be some way to stimulate his nervous system. And that's where they found their PX doc. His insight scans revealed exactly what they suspected, that there was a disconnect, an interference with how Cohen's nervous system was processing information and coordinating actions that end up in movement and speech and vocalization. His parents said, looking through his scans and talking with the docs, it finally all made sense as to why he was struggling and why progress had been very slow, because so many kids have gone through hours and hours, months or years of speech therapy, and progress is either slow or completely plateaued and stuck. And we're going to break through that with this conversation right here. Because for Cohen, that's where the breakthrough came. About 2 months into getting adjusted, neurotonal, neurologically focused chiropractic, it seemed like a switch flipped for Cohen, they said. He started producing way more sounds than before. He began initiating sounds and words on his own without prompting from others. And lately, he has just been talking away. Today, Cohen has gained about 3 years of progress in just 3 months and is finishing up his speech services and being released from those because he's met all of his goals in record time. The conversation we're about to have, we've actually been blessed to not only teach it to thousands of parents and be able to have this lead them to the breakthrough they're looking for their child, but we actually teach this to PTs, OTs, and speech therapists all the time as well. So if your child is going through speech therapy and maybe they are stuck or progress is slower than you'd like, will you please share this with your incredible professionals on that team as well? Because what we found is that's the pediatric PTs, OTs, and speech therapists who, when they go back to their education and they lean on their own common sense and gut understanding, they know that there's more going on beneath the surface than the expression and muscular output in coordination as well. And generally what I have found is that pediatric speech therapists, OTs, and PTs are super neuroscience nerds just like me and our team. So they'll love this stuff too. And again, even though we could absolutely, especially if we were talking nerd to nerd in a professional setting, we could go way more intricate and into the complexities and intricacies of speech and communication and coordination than we're going to with this one. Nobody needs to. We actually don't need to as providers, and you definitely don't need to understand it any deeper than you will after this one right here, because speech is that 3-step process. And what most kids are missing and what traditional therapies and interventions can't quite get into deep enough and hit reset, repair, and stimulate and get the nervous system back on track, that's what's missing. And that's what we're going to talk about right here with this one. Okay, so we've been talking about this a few times. Let's really lay it out super clearly. Speech, the way it works within the brain, the nervous system, and then yes, the muscles are going to need to come into play here. So the neuromotor or neuromuscular system. Speech is a complex, yet I like to say pretty simple, sequential. Hang on to that word. It's very sequential 3-step process. And again, most people don't look at the step 1 and step 2, but if we don't, that's where the root cause, therefore that's where the breakthrough solution is. It's the sensory and auditory signals that are first received from what's called the sensory dorsal horn of the spinal cord, from the brainstem and from the brain itself. I want you to write that one down if you're listening in as input. So the first component of proper speech execution, formation, and expression is actually input. So before there can be output, step 1 on this 3-step process is input. Then there's the middleman. Once that sensory auditory input comes into the brain and autonomic nervous system needs to properly, fully process it, integrate, and coordinate that information. So you can write it down as input first, integration second. And finally, from there, with proper, clean, non-interfered, non-obstructed input is what we need to get to, and clean, efficient, full integration and processing, the third step is that the brain and nervous system sends these coordinated, completed signals to the muscles that form up speech. So that's output. So quick review: input first, integration second, output third. The challenge, like pretty much all neurodevelopmental symptoms, even ADHD works this way. ADHD isn't a behavior output problem. It's a sensory input problem. Anxiety actually isn't an emotional output problem. It's a sensory input and integration in coordination and challenge. So most people assume that speech delays stem from these muscle problems on the output stage. But nearly every single case, and I'm not saying that those muscles don't need to be put through therapy and to be better strengthened and stimulated, but what if they're not getting the proper nerve supply? What if the sensory input and incoordination is completely obstructed, distorted, and interfered with via something we call subluxation, which is really simple? Well, then no matter how many exercises, no matter how many therapy sessions you do, if the input and the integration is distorted and obstructed, the output and the expression is not going to work. So really the issue is upstream within the brain and the nervous system's input and integration phases. And that's where this thing called subluxation, nervous system interference, dysfunction, dysregulation, and dysautonomia really set up shop. Now, subluxation is the nerdy neurological chiropractic term for misalignment, tension, so certain muscles become too hypertonic and too wound up. And also, when you have this misalignment, reduced range of motion, you not only get some muscles that are hypertonic and too tight, but you get others that are hypotonic and too weak, so they can't create that execution, even if they were to get the proper stimulation and control and coordination from the brain. So subluxation is the neurological interference. And where does it set up shop? Step 1, input, and step 2, integration. So subluxation often looks like an expression problem. We can find the presence of subluxation through things like surface EMG scans, what are called the insight scans. We can find subluxation via what's called palpation or evaluation with postural distortion. We can find the hypertonic, too tight, wound up nerves and muscles. But we also, if you're really seeing a trained, neurologically focused pediatric chiropractor, they use the insight scans and their palpation and their exam to not only find the tight, the wound up, sympathetic dominant spots, but we need to find the areas that are too weak, too hypotonic, and too understimulated as well. And now that I go down that road, I do realize that at the beginning of this conversation, I think I said I was going to keep it more simple and more straightforward, but perhaps getting into hypertonicity and hypotonicity is even a little bit extra nerdy for me. But what you want to be sure your child has is, first and foremost, a neurologically focused pediatric chiropractor as the foundation of the team working to help your child with their speech delays. Not because speech therapy, OT, and PT are not world-changing, incredible, and so helpful, but what if they can only do so much if that subluxation and that interference is there? And where would that have come from? Birth interventions like forceps, vacuum, C-section, cord wrapped, induction, sunny side up. That is what causes these upper cervical misalignments, subluxations, and interference with not only the sensory nerves that are in the auditory and the muscle complex, but also another nerve called the vagus nerve. So the last nerdy part of this one is that vagus nerve dysfunction. The vagus nerve is a cranial nerve that branches right from the brainstem, and the vagus nerve is actually involved in speech not only through the sensory input afferent standpoint, But the vagus nerve also has some of its nerve fibers that go out and directly support the motor control, vocalization, pitch, volume, speech clarity. So proper speech coordination and production really relies on the vagus nerve. There's a tie-in to breathing and swallowing, which are directly influenced by vagus nerve function. The truth is, from birth trauma, so often the vagus nerve, the sensory processing center, and these other key neuromotor speech and coordination kind of air traffic control areas are really thrown off course from birth. And that's why months, sometimes even years later, these speech delays show up and look like an output problem, look like a muscular problem, but they're really a sensory input integration, subluxation, and vagus nerve dysfunction connected problem. Okay. So now that we got, it's me on this one, a little bit nerdy or a lot of bit nerdy, and really broke down the neuromechanism of speech delays, how do we find it? How do we help? Step number one, you get connected with a PX doc who knows to dive deep into your child's case history. See if there is things like maternal distress or fetal distress, which would be a high stress pregnancy, but especially if there's things like birth trauma or even things like the overexposure to toxins, overuse of antibiotics, that can create what's called neuroinflammation, and the vagus nerve and the brainstem are really sensitive to neuroinflammation as well, and that can mess with the input and the coordination and integration like we're talking about. The physical injury from forceps, vacuum, C-section, those are the ones that are pretty black and white, and the most common causative kind of hidden in plain sight trigger of speech delays that not enough professionals, whether it be the conventional pediatrician or honestly even, pediatric therapists, are trained fully to understand and communicate with. And again, even if we do find out through the case history that it's subluxation, that it's nervous system dysfunction and vagus nerve dysfunction, we got to find it through an examination, and we've got to do something about it, and that would be called neurologically focused or neurotonal adjustments. Okay, so that first key step is to dig into the case history and see if there's clues there to say, okay, there's evidence that subluxation is likely there within your child's brainstem, upper cervical spine, vagus nerve dysfunction, all that is there. We can so often find that in the case history. Now, for those of you listening here on the podcast, I obviously can't pop up a picture of the inside scans right now. But what's so cool about the way that our work happens is everything comes to life with those inside scans. And when it comes to speech delays, through the entire course of my career, I have seen time and time again that our neurothermal scans will show clear neuroinflammation and interference around C1, which is atlas, and C2 and C3, which are the axis, and the areas that very, very directly, intricately, entirely are connected to speech input, step one, integration, step two, and then expression and formation, step three. And often we'll see quite a bit of subluxation and interference on the thermal scan and the EMG. And in that one, electromyography is what EMG stands for. So it's the neurological measurement of the myomuscular system. So EMG scans are very important for our speech delay kiddos. And we'll see tons of tension and what's called counter torque, asymmetrical presentation throughout the cervical spine, often even into the mid and lower cervical spine, where kind of some of the final formations, expressions, and executions of speech are. So again, in 90 to 95% of cases we see in our clinic with speech delays, we can see the smoking gun in both the case history and on the inside scans. And then, of course, we do our physical exam. We check for subluxation via palpation, looking for postural distortions, gait and movement incoordinations, because the child has speech delays, which is this fine motor, sensory motor activity. Usually, they also have some gross motor or kind of whole body incoordination. So oftentimes, if your child has speech delays, they might also kind of fit what we call the drunken bull presentation, where they're struggle to ride a bike, struggle with handwriting, struggle with reading, struggle with sports, hand-eye coordination, maybe their gait, their posture is a little off-kilter or a lot off-kilter and discombobulated. So a lot of times that is connected, and we will find those on our broader and more complete examination as well. So again, I know those of you listening in on the podcast, you have to kind of visualize that in your mind. But if your child has speech delays and you've been doing speech therapy and they've been awesome and they're doing everything they can, but progress is slow, stalled, or stuck altogether, and your child is not yet getting adjusted, you haven't had the CSI with the PX doc and case history and dug into a consult with a doctor like that who really looks at these neurological connections, and most importantly, you haven't had the insight scans and a real, true, neurologically focused care plan and series of adjustments, that may be, very well likely is, the breakthrough you're looking for to get the results you want with speech and speech challenges, speech delay. And honestly, throughout the course of my career, we've even had some incredible results with apraxia where kiddos were not, a lot like Cohen, really not making any sounds, any vocalizations, any speech and communication at all. We've just seen countless kids go from, basically nothing to nowadays, you never know. They fully got back on track because subluxation sets up shop on the input, step 1, and the integration, step 2. So yeah, there's going to be trouble downstream with the expression and the formation. But if we get rid of that obstruction, we get rid of that interference upstream, well, then the way God designed our kids to be is that downstream healing is to be expected. So no matter your child's age, no matter how long they've been struggling with these speech challenges, find out if they're subluxated. Find out if that nervous system dysfunction, vagus nerve dysfunction, dysregulation is underneath all that. Get connected with your PX doc. Get connected with a local neurologically focused pediatric and family chiropractor. Dive deeper, find out, and then please keep us in the loop. Report back. We love literally hearing these miracles, right? It's really something when your child is struggling with speech, and then even often it's a couple of weeks, couple of months into care, just like Cohen, all of a sudden that thing turns back on. The brain is connected. It can smoothly move through all 3 steps of speech input, integration, and formation. I hope that my speech was clear. I hope that the way I was able to teach this and communicate this to you and your family and your team was clear and made sense, because speech is complicated, intricate, and incredible, but it's also pretty simple. You got to fix step 1 and step 2 to get step 3, speech formation, back online once again. God bless, be well, see you on the next one.